try to sit down and start over and see if we can do better before it's too late. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, there is a reason why the favorability rating of the United States Congress is somewhere on a good day around 10%. And the reason is, I think, pretty simple. The American people are hurting. They look to their elected officials to try to do something to address the problems that they have and the crises facing our country. And time after time, they see the United States Congress not only not responding to the needs they face, but in many cases doing exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. In poll after poll, the American people tell us that the most pressing issue that they face, it deals with the economy and high unemployment. Mr. President, I know when we look in the newspapers, we are told that the official unemployment rate is 7%, and by the way, that is a rate that has in recent months gone down, and that's a good thing. But the truth of the matter is, if you include people who have given up looking for work and people who are working part-time when they want to work full-time, real unemployment in this country is 13.2%. That is enormously high. The unemployment rate for our young people is close to 20%, and there are parts of the country where it is higher than that. African American youth unemployment is close to 40%. So what we are looking at all over this country are millions and millions of people who want jobs, who want to work, who can't find those jobs. We are looking at a younger generation of workers who cannot get into the economy. And if you're a young person and you leave high school, for example, and you can't get a job in your first year out there or your second year, if you think that this does not have a cataclysmic impact on your confidence, on your self-esteem, you are very, very mistaken. And I fear very much and worry very much about the millions of young people who are out there who are not in school, who are not working. And tragically, many of those young people will end up on drugs. Some of them are going to end up on jail. And these are issues that we have got to deal with. Now, what the American people tell us over and over again is, yes, the deficit is a serious problem. I believe it is. Everybody in the Congress believes that it is. But what the American people also say is high unemployment is an even more serious issue. According to a March 2013 Gallup poll, 75% of the American people, including 56% of Republicans, 74% of independents, and 93% of Democrats, support, and I quote, a federal job creation law that would spend government money for a program designed to create more than 1 million new jobs, end of quote. So what the American people are saying is, yes, we have made progress in the last 4 years. We've cut the deficit in half. We've got to do more. But what the American people are saying loudly and clearly is we need to create jobs. And what they also understand, and poll after poll indicates this, that when you have an infrastructure which is crumbling, roads, bridges, water systems, wastewater plants, our rail system, when you have an infrastructure that is crumbling, we need to invest in rebuilding that infrastructure, and when you do that, you create significant numbers of jobs. That is what the American people want us to do. Mr. President, when is the last time you even heard that debate here on the floor of the Senate? The unemployment crisis, the need to create jobs. That is what the American people want us to do, and we're not even talking about that issue. Second issue the American people are very clear about. You know, it's a funny thing. Sometimes the media writes about how partisan the Congress is, how divisive the Congress is. Senator Grassley and I supposedly hate each other, we don't talk to each other, and all that nonsense. That's not the reality. The truth is that among the American people, surprisingly enough, there is a lot of consensus, I mentioned a moment ago that the American people very strongly believe that we should invest in our infrastructure and create jobs. Unfortunately, that is not what we're doing. And here's another issue, Mr. President, that the American people are loud and clear upon. They understand that tragically, in today's economy, most of the new jobs that are being created are not good-paying jobs. That is the sad reality. Most of the new jobs that are being created in today's economy are low-wage jobs, and many of them are part-time jobs. So if you're making $8, $9 an hour and you're working 30 hours a week, you're going to have a very hard time supporting yourself, let alone a family. So what do the American people say? They say, raise the minimum wage. Raise the minimum wage. And let me quote from today's Wall Street Journal, Quote, Americans strongly favor boosting the federal minimum wage to $10.10 an hour, but oppose raising it above that. A Wall Street Journal NBC News poll finds. In the survey, 63% supported a rise to $10.10 an hour from the current $7.25 rate. End of quote. 63% of the American people support that. Democrats strongly support it. Independents support it. Many Republicans support it. One would think, therefore, when the vast majority of the American people understand that $7.25 an hour is a starvation wage and that we need to raise the minimum wage to at least $10.10 an hour, that we'd be moving on it. That maybe we get a UC on it, unanimous consent. Let's get it done. I fear very much that right here in the Senate, we are going to have a very, very difficult time gaining 60 votes. I hope that I am wrong. I sincerely do. But I'm not aware at this point that there are any Republicans prepared to support an increase of the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. And I believe that in the Republican-controlled House, it would be extremely difficult to get legislation widely supported by the American people through that body. But not only will my Republican colleagues not do what the American people want in terms of raising the minimum wage, quite incredibly, Mr. President, I have to tell you that many of my Republican colleagues do not believe in the concept of the minimum wage. Many of them believe we should abolish the concept of the minimum wage, so that if you're in a situation in a high unemployment area where where workers are desperate for work, and an employer says, well, here's $4 an hour, take it or leave it, well, that's okay for some of my Republican colleagues. So again, we are in a situation where the vast majority of the American people want to do something about low wages. They want to raise the minimum wage, and we're going to have a very, very difficult time getting that legislation through. And I hope I'm wrong. But I do know that unless the American people stand up, get on the phone, start calling their senators and members of Congress, we probably will not succeed in doing what the American people want. And interestingly enough, Mr. President, what the American people also understand is that raising the minimum wage will help us with the federal deficit in a variety of ways. It may be a surprise to some Americans to know that the largest welfare recipient in the United States of America happens, coincidentally, to be the wealthiest family in America. The Walton family who own Walmart are worth about $100 billion. They are the wealthiest family in America. They own more wealth as one family than the bottom 40% of the American people. Extraordinary wealth. And one of the reasons they are so wealthy is the American taxpayer subsidizes Walmart because Walmart pays low wages, provides minimal benefits, and many of their workers end up on Medicaid, they end up on food stamps, they end up in government-subsidized housing. Now, I'm not quite sure why the middle class and working families of this country have to subsidize the Walton family because they pay wages that are inadequate for their workers to live a dignified life. So my hope is that when the American people are loud and clear about the need to raise the minimum wage, that Congress will respond. But I have to tell you, I have my doubts. Mr. President, what we also hear, and most recently from Pope Francis, is an understanding that there is something profoundly wrong about a nation, and increasingly a world, in which so few have so much and so many have so little. In the United States of America today, we have more wealth and income inequality than at any time since the late 1920s, and we have more wealth and income inequality than any other major country on earth. Mr. President, today the top 1% of our population owns 38% of the wealth of America, financial wealth of this country, and the bottom 60% owns 2.3%. Top 1% owns 38% of the wealth of America. The bottom 60% owns 2.3%. Is that really what America is supposed to be about? I think not. And I think Pope Francis recently talked about that issue, talked about the moral aspects of that issue, and I think he is exactly right. So, Mr. President, those are some of the issues that we have to talk about. Another issue out there that I think we have to be very clear about. And again, the American people are extraordinarily clear about this. The American people understand that Social Security has been probably the most successful federal program in the modern history of this country. For the last 70-plus years, it has kept seniors out of poverty. In fact, before Social Security, 50% of seniors in this country lived in poverty. Today, that number, while too high, is about 9.5%. That's a significant improvement. And Social Security, despite what is going on in the economy, in good times and bad times, has never once failed to pay out all of the benefits owed to every eligible American. Today, Social Security has a $2.7 trillion surplus, can pay out every benefit owed to every eligible American for the next 20 years. And you know what the American people say about Social Security? They say it loudly and clearly. Republicans say it, independents say it, Democrats say it. Do not cut Social Security. Do not cut Social Security. And yet I have to tell you, Mr. President, virtually all Republicans think we should cut Social Security. Some Democrats believe we should cut Social Security. President of the United States has talked about a chain CPI. Very bad idea about cutting Social Security. Maybe we should listen to the American people and make it very clear, no, we're not going to cut Social Security. In fact, we're going to take a new look at Social Security and see not only how we can make it solvent not just for 20 years, but for 50 years, and in addition to that, increase benefits. And there are pretty easy ways to do that, including lifting the cap on taxable income that goes into the Social Security Trust Fund. As you know, Mr. President, today somebody makes $100 million, somebody makes $113,000. They both contribute the same amount into the Social Security Trust Fund. Lift that cap, you can start at a level of $250,000. You'll solve the Social Security solvency issue for the next 50 60 years. And that is exactly what we should do, and that is what the American people want us to do. In terms of Medicare, people say, well, Medicare has financial problems. It does. But the issue, and interestingly enough, it gets back to what Senator Graham was talking about. He was talking about his health care plan, South Carolina. It sounds like a pretty bad plan to me. I agree with him. But what's the issue there? The issue that we have got to look at, which we don't, for obvious reasons, is how does it happen, Mr. President, that in the United States of America, before the Affordable Care Act, things will change a little bit, before the Affordable Care Act, we have 48 million people who are uninsured. We had tens of millions more people who have high deductibles, like Senator Graham, $6,000 deductibles in comprehensive, high co-payments, and yet, at the end of the day, 48 million people uninsured, high deductibles, high co-payments, health outcomes that are not particularly good, better than some countries, worse than many other countries, infant mortality, worse, longevity, worse, life expectancy, worse. And yet we end up spending twice as much per person on health care as any other nation. How does that happen? How do we spend so much and get so little value? Is that an issue we are prepared to discuss? Well, I guess not. Because the private insurance companies say, don't talk about that. We're making a whole lot of money out of the current health care system, including the Affordable Care Act. We make a lot of money. Our CEOs do. Yeah, we're spending 30 cents of every dollar on administrative costs, on bureaucracy, on advertising. Don't touch that, because that's the American health care system. Well, I would suggest that we have to take a hard look at what goes on around the rest of the world. Now, somebody has said, people have said, we have the best health care system in the world. That's not what the American people say. The polls that I have seen is that there is less satisfaction with our system than exists in other countries around the world, for obvious reasons. We spend a lot, we get relatively little. Are we prepared as a Congress to stand up to the insurance companies? Are we prepared to stand up to the drug companies that charge us far higher prices for prescription drugs than any other country on earth? Are we prepared to stand up to the medical equipment suppliers? I don't think so, because that gets us then into the issue of campaign finance and where people get their money to run for office, because these guys contribute a whole lot of money. Are we prepared to stand up to Wall Street? You got 6 financial institutions on Wall Street that have assets of over $9 trillion, equivalent to 2/3 of the GDP of the United States of America. They write half of the mortgages in this country, 2/3 of the credit cards. Well, do you think maybe it's time to break these guys up? Or are we going to march down the path of too big to fail and have to bail them out again? Hear a whole lot of discussion about that, Mr. President? No, not too often. So let me conclude, and last point that I want to make is we had the president of the World Bank here just yesterday talking about global warming. As I think most people know, virtually the entire scientific community, people who study the issue of global warming, understand that the planet is warming significantly, that it is already causing devastating problems, that the issue is man-made, and that if we do not address this crisis by cutting greenhouse gas emissions, moving away from fossil fuel, the habitability of this planet for our kids and our grandchildren is very, very much in question. That's what the scientific community says. Have you heard, Mr. President, any debate on this floor about how we're going to aggressively transform our energy system? We don't do it. So, Mr. President, let me simply conclude by saying this. There is a reason why the United States Congress has a favorability rating of about 10%. And that is that the American people are hurting, and we are not responding to that pain. We are not addressing the many crises facing this country, and the American people are saying to Congress, what world do you live in? How about joining our world? How about paying attention to our needs? So, Mr. President, with that, I would yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
We are in post-cloture debate on a nominee for the District Court of the District of Columbia, the Circuit Court for the District of Columbia. I want to speak on that nomination, but I'm also going to take time to speak on issues dealing with the Defense Department, issues dealing with the Farm Bill, and issues dealing with the new nominee for the Department of Homeland Security. So I'll take a few minutes to discuss the President's ongoing scheme to stack the D.C. Circuit with committed ideologues so that the President's regulatory agenda doesn't run into judicial roadblocks. Yesterday, the Senate confirmed the first of three nominees to the D.C. Circuit that the court does not need. Let me emphasize that, does not need. Of course, the Senate denied its consent on these nominees just a few short weeks ago. So then you can ask, what has changed during that time? The vote count certainly hasn't changed. It's not as if Democrats persuaded some of the Republicans who are their colleagues to change their mind. That's what you'd expect in a body that operates based upon rules that guarantee the minority a voice. That's what you'd expect in what is supposed to be the greatest deliberative body on earth. This body is not the House of Representatives, where minority views are not given that same consideration. That's what you would expect under normal circumstances. But as I explained in a speech earlier this week on another nominee for the same court, these are not normal circumstances. No, today's circumstances are different. Today's the President's legislative agenda can't get traction in Congress. And no, it isn't because Republicans won't negotiate with the President. It's because the President of the United States is out of step with the American people. Today, the President's signature health care law, which was passed without a single Republican vote, is becoming more and more unpopular with each passing day. And no, it isn't because the administration hasn't done a good job of messaging Obamacare. It's precisely because of that message. Today, the President can't get climate change legislation passed by Congress. And no, it isn't simply because of Republican opposition. It's because the President's agenda is too extreme even for some Senate Democrats. So the President and his agenda are out of step with the American people, and as a result, he can't get his agenda adopted in this Congress. But that doesn't seem to matter to the radical liberal interest groups who support the policy initiatives of the President. They want more no matter what. These liberal interest groups aren't satisfied with the separation of power, that being the constitutional separation of power. They want the President and his allies in the Senate to do whatever it takes to get the same results they would if there were 535 members of Congress just as liberal as the President. Those interest groups want the President to legislate by executive order and by administrative action. They want the President to suspend the law when it suits his purpose, just as the English kings used to do. In fact, the reason our Constitution requires, and let me emphasize requires, the President to, quote unquote, faithfully execute the law is because the English kings would unilaterally, selectively, and very often suspend laws passed by the Parliament. But none of this matters to the liberal interest groups. They want results no matter what. In fact, the President made such a practice of legislating by executive order and administrative action that he has created a real expectation among his most faithful supporters that there's nothing he can't do unilaterally. Just a week or two ago, the President was delivering a speech in California when one of his own supporters interrupted and heckled him for not issuing an executive order to stop all deportations. the heckler shouted, quote, "Use your executive order to halt deportations of 11.5 million undocumented immigrants in this country. You have the power to stop deportations right now." End of that constituent's quote. The President responded, "Actually, I don't." That's the President's quote. "Actually, I don't." The President added, quote, "We're a nation of laws." Now, I must say, I understand the confusion. The most extreme elements of the President's supporters have witnessed him pick and choose which laws he will faithfully execute and which he will suspend, or as the President likes to say, waive. So it's no wonder that those supporters would say, just issue an executive order. We want results, just like King George III. It's no wonder that those supporters would say, we don't care that there isn't support in the Congress to pass legislation imposing cap-and-trade fee increases. We want results, just like George III. It's no wonder that those supporters would say, we don't care if Democrats block judges to the D.C. Circuit based on the standards the Republicans are applying today. That was then. This is now. We want results, just like George III. It's no wonder that those supporters would say, we don't care about 2 centuries of Senate history and tradition that has been passed down faithfully from one majority leader to the next. We want results, just like George III. Climate change regulations are too important. Salvaging Obamacare is too important. So, as we all know, the majority buckled to the pressure from these extreme liberal interest groups and broke the rules in the Senate to change the rules. They tossed aside 2 centuries of Senate history and tradition, a history and tradition that up until 2 weeks ago had been jealously guarded and carefully preserved by each succeeding majority leaders, leaders who remember the history of George III. They did all of this just so they could install the President's handpicked judges to hear challenges to his signature health care law and to the rest of his regulatory agenda, like climate change regulation as another example. But when a president selects a nominee for the specific purpose of rubber stamping his agenda, an agenda that has proven too extreme for even members of his own party, he needs a judge who can be counted upon to follow through on approving those regulations. But given that it's inappropriate to ask prospective nominees how they'd rule on particular cases, how would this White House make certain that their nominees would follow through and rubber stamp the President's agenda? Well, based upon Professor Pillard's record, and that's the nominee we'll be voting on tomorrow, apparently the White House looked out over academia and selected the most liberal nominee that they could find, because Professor Pillard fits that bill to a T. I've heard my colleagues come to the floor and argue that these nominees to the D.C. Circuit are mainstream. Professor Pillard may be a fine person, but make no mistake about it, she isn't mainstream. That's the furthest from it. I'm sure that the White House is confident she can be counted upon to rubber stamp its agenda, but don't confuse her views with the mainstream of American legal tradition. And I have a sampling of things that she has written and said, and I ask you then to determine, is she mainstream? She has written this about abortion, quote, casting reproductive rights in terms of equality holds promise to recenter the debate towards the real stakes for women and men of unwanted pregnancies and away from the deceptive images of fetus as autonomous being that the anti-choice movement has popularized, end of quote. Now, think of deceptive images of fetus as autonomous beings. Is that mainstream? She argued this about motherhood. Reproductive rights, including the right to contraception and abortion, play a central role in freeing women from historically routine conscription into maternity. Now, think about that. Historically routine conscription into maternity. Is that mainstream? She has also argued this about motherhood, quote, anti-abortion laws and other restraints on reproductive freedom not only enforce women's incubation of unwanted pregnancies, but also prescribe a vision of the woman's role as mother and caretaker of children in a way that is at odds with equal protection, end of quote. Is that in the mainstream? And what about her views on religious freedom? This really ought to shock you. She argued that the Supreme Court case of Hosanna Tabor Evangelical Lutheran Church, which challenged the so-called ministerial exception to employment discrimination, represented, quote, a substantial threat to the American rule of law, end of quote. Now, the Supreme Court rejected her view 9-0, 9-0, and the court held that, quote, it is impermissible for the government to contradict a church determination of who can act as its ministers, end of quote. Do my colleagues honestly believe that it's within the mainstream to argue churches shouldn't be allowed to choose their own ministers? I don't think so. I asked Professor Pillard about Hosanna Tabor and religious freedom at her hearing. She testified this way, quote, and I have to admit, Senator Grassley, I really called it wrong on that case. I did not predict that the court would rule as it did, end of quote. In other words, she tried to dodge the question by leaving the committee members with the impression that she had merely taken a stab at predicting the case's outcome and that she had gotten it wrong. But of course, I wasn't troubled that Professor Pillard had wrongly predicted the outcome. I was troubled because she actually argued that a ruling in favor of the church would represent, quote, a substantial threat to the American rule of law. I don't believe that there is a single member of this body on either side of the aisle who would subscribe to that argument any more than the 9 justices of the Supreme Court did. If I'm wrong about that, then I'd like to hear the senator explain how it's mainstream to argue that granting our churches the latitude to choose their own ministers represents a substantial threat to the American rule of law. So these are the so-called mainstream views the President wants to install on a court that will hear challenges to his most important priorities. Is it any wonder that the President apparently has high confidence in Professor Pillard rubber stamping his agenda? Before I close on this point, let me make one final point. Given the circumstances surrounding these nominees, how these nominees were selected and nominated, given all 3 were nominated and simultaneously for the purpose of changing judicial outcomes and rubber stamping the President's agenda, and given they were nominated and rammed through the process without regard to the fact that there isn't even enough work for them to do, given the President was originally denied consent under the rules of the Senate, given the President and certain far-left liberal interest groups then successfully persuaded the majority of the Senate to cast aside 2 centuries of Senate history and tradition in order to get them confirmed, given the extremely liberal record that I discussed, if you were a litigant challenging the President or one of his administrative actions, and you drew a panel comprised of Professor Pillard, Millett, and Judge Wilkins, can you honestly say that you'd be confident that you would get a fair shake before that panel? Of course not. And that, my colleagues, is a sad commentary on the damage the President and the Senate majority have inflicted not only on the United States Senate, but also on our judiciary and fundamental notions of the rule of law, tending towards what our Constitution tried to overcome, the actions that were prevalent during colonial times that King George III would take. I urge my colleagues to oppose the Pillard nomination. Mr. President, for several years, I've been trying to get the Defense Department Inspector General to do their job, and I've had several investigations, a lot of them implemented because of information that comes to me from whistleblowers. And I would speak to that point now to talk about two important audits that were bungled by the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. There is something very important that I need to say right up front. A brand new Inspector General, Mr. John Reimer, is now in place. The events that I'm about to describe happened a few years ago. None reflect on his leadership, which I hope will bring about a big change in the Inspector General's office at the Department of Defense. When faced with a frontal assault on its audit authority by the target of one of its audits, senior IG officials got a bad case of weak knees and caved under pressure. They trashed high-quality audit work that was critical of a certified public accounting firm and its opinions. In doing this, they covered up reportable deficiencies. They allowed the audit target to run roughshod over sacred oversight prerogatives without uttering one word of protest or asking one single question. I'm talking about audits of the financial statements produced by the Department's Central Accounting Office. This is what I refer to as DFAS, D-F-A-S, that stands for Defense Finance and Accounting Services. The audits were conducted by a CPA firm, but supposedly under the watchful eye of the Inspector General, or IG, but not really under his eye. The story of the two bungled audits is told in an oversight report, which I have now posted on my website. While I received the first anonymous emails on this matter in April 2012, my audit oversight work actually began more than 5 years ago. It was triggered by a steady stream of tips from whistleblowers complaining about the quality of these audits. These reports then grabbed my attention. My colleagues may wonder why the senator from Iowa is down in the weeds in such arcane issues. The reason is simple. It's the importance of audits. Audits are probably the primary oversight tool for rooting out fraud and waste in the government. To protect the taxpayers, Congress needs to ensure that government audits are as good as they can be. They must produce tangible results. They must be able to detect theft, waste, mismanagement, and then recommend corrective action. With mounting pressure for serious belt-tightening under sequestration, audits have taken on an even greater importance. Audits should help senior management separate the wheat from the chaff and apply mandated cuts where they belong. Sequestration cuts should be guided by hard-hitting, rock-solid audits. Unfortunately, rock-solid audits produced by the Inspector General's office are hard to come by, and that's the problem. After evaluating hundreds of audits, I issued 3 oversight reports in the years 2010 and 2012. With a few notable exceptions, I found that the Inspector General's audits we're weak, we're ineffective, and we're wasteful. Wasteful when you consider that we spend $100 million a year to produce them. Poor leadership is part of the problem. But there is still another driver, and that's the department's broken accounting system. It allows fraud and waste to go undetected and unchecked. That's bad enough. But the lack of credible financial information makes it very difficult to produce hard-hitting audits. Auditors are forced to do audit trail reconstruction work to connect the dots on the money trails. And of course, that is very labor-intensive, very time-consuming work. Although the department continues to spend billions to fix the busted accounting system, I'm sorry to say it is still not working right. The department cannot pass the Chief Financial Officers Act audit test. It is unable to accurately report on how the taxpayers' money is spent, as it is required to do each year under that law. By comparison, every other federal agency has passed that test. Why not the Department of Defense? So long as the accounting system is dysfunctional, audits will remain weak and ineffective, and the probability of rooting out much fraud and waste during sequestration is low, and then still continuing to waste $100 million that we spend on the Inspector General's office. And while I'm talking about the need for better audits, I would like to offer a word of encouragement to the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, John Sopko. He's the head of SIGAR. That's the name of the Inspector General for Afghan for short. When SIGAR is cranking out aggressive, hard-hitting audits, and I commend SIGAR for doing that, setting a good example. The audits that I'm about to discuss by contrast deserve darts, not laurels. Mr. President, I first came to the floor to speak on this subject November the 14th, 2012. At that point, I had completed a preliminary view of 7 red flags or potential problem areas that popped up on my radar screen. Since then, I have double-checked the facts. I have confirmed my preliminary observations. I did this by examining the official audit records known as work papers. So I will not walk the same ground again tonight. Instead, I will briefly summarize what I did, how I did it, what I found, why it's important, and offer some fixes for consideration. To conduct this investigation, I had to examine literally thousands of documents. I could not have done it without the help and guidance of CPA qualified government auditors. Evidence uncovered in the work papers was validated with interviews and written inquiries with knowledgeable officials. Together, these tell the story of what really happened, and of course, it's not a pretty picture. True, my report is nothing more than a snapshot in time, but if this snapshot accurately reflects the work being produced by the IG Audit Office, then we have big, big problems. In a nutshell, this is what I found out. A CPA firm, Urbach, Kahn, and Werlen, will go by UKW, had awarded an unblemished string of 7 clean opinions on Central Accounting Agency's financial statements. When the IG stepped in and took a 2-year snapshot for fiscal years 2008 and 2009, it was supposed to report on whether those statements and opinions met prescribed audit standards. But due to a series of ethical blunders, that job was never finished. A 3rd review was planned for 2010, but after the 2008-09 fiasco, that was canceled, allowing DFAS, I want to explain the Defense Finance and Accounting Service. It allowed DFAS to rack up another string of clean opinions through last year. Although this work probably cost the taxpayers in excess of $20 million altogether. The work performed by DFAS in 2008 and 9 was substandard. The outside audit firm rubber-stamped DFAS's flawed practices using defective audit methods. For its part, the Inspector General was prepared to call foul on the CPA firm for substandard work, but got sidetracked and then steamrolled by DFAS. The contract gave the IG preeminent oversight authority to accept or reject the firm's opinions. The whole purpose of the contract was to position the auditors to make that determination. If the firm's opinions met prescribed standards, they would be endorsed. If not, the IG would issue non-endorsement report. On both the fiscal year 2008 and 2009 audits, the record clearly indicates the IG's audit team determined that the firm's opinions did not meet prescribed standards. They did not merit endorsement. Though I cannot cite work papers to prove it, whistleblowers allege that top management ordered them to endorse the 2008 opinion with this caveat. If known deficiencies were not corrected in 2009 opinion, a non-endorsement was guaranteed. Well, when the very same deficiencies popped up again, in other words, in 2009 like in 2008, the auditors prepared a hard-hitting non-endorsement report as promised. It was even signed. The transmittal letter was ready to go to the door, out the door. The non-endorsement decision had been communicated to DFAS via email in unmistakable terms. In line with that decision and contract requirements, the IG took steps to cut off payment to this CPA firm based on advice of the Inspector General's legal counsel. The next step was to issue the non-endorsement report. But this is where the Inspector General chickened out. In a power vacuum, DFAS moved swiftly to block the report with a blatant end-run maneuver to bypass independent oversight. So, DFAS literally neutered independent oversight by the Inspector General with two bold news. On the same day, the IG's office notified DFAS in writing that a non-endorsement report would be forthcoming. DFAS unilaterally and proudly declared that it had earned a clean opinion and ordered that all disputed invoices be paid. This was an act of out-and-out defiance. Next, it kicked the IG off the contract. Yes, I can tell my colleagues, you heard me right. The agency being audited literally kicked the Inspector General, the oversight agency, clean off the oversight contract. In making this end-run maneuver, DFAS broke every rule in the audit books. What happened was frontal assault on the Inspector General's oversight authority. The frontal assault was mounted by the agency being subjected to the audit and by an agency whose financial reports were found to be grossly deficient. In the face of such outright defiance, I would like to think that any Inspector General would have stood up to the offending agency and held its ground and protected and defended its oversight prerogatives. That's the law, but not the Department of Defense Inspector General. Instead, the IG's knees buckled under pressure. The IG retreated before the onslaught. The IG caved and trashed the report. The IG rolled over and played possum, giving DFAS the green light to proceed full speed ahead. And the IG accepted these blatant transgressions without expressing one word of criticism, without expressing one concern, without raising one single question. Other than a lone hotline complaint that disappeared down a black hole, no protest was ever lodged. No corrective action was ever proposed, and obviously no corrective action ever taken. The Inspector General's silence appeared to signal total acquiescence to a series of actions that undermined the integrity of the audit process, which is the basis for ferreting out waste, fraud, and mismanagement and illegal activity. For a senator who watches the watchdogs, what I see here is a disgrace to the entire Inspector General community. The IG allowed DFAS to run roughshod over the contract, the audit, the IG Act, audit standards, and independent oversight. And the audit firm probably got paid for the work that was never performed, payments that were alleged to be improper. Instead of exposing poor practices and improper actions by both accounting agencies and the CPA firm, the Office of Inspector General allowed sacred principles to be trampled. It just kept quiet. It turned a blind eye to what was going on. It hunkered down. It tried to cover its tracks. Two misguided acts set the stage for the collapse of oversight of these audits. The problem began with the contract. At the insistence of the Department's Chief Financial Officer and Accounting Agency, the IG agreed to a contractual arrangement that put DFAS, the target of the audit, in the driver's seat. This contract allegedly violated the IG Act and standing audit policies, according to the Assistant IG who spoke out at that particular time. To address this issue, a fragile waiver arrangement was crafted. It was supposed to address the legal issues and protect the Office of Inspector General's interests under the DFAS contract. All the parties involved agreed to abide by this questionable setup. But being nothing more than an informal trust, it came unglued under the pressure and controversy generated by the non-endorsement decision. Even the Office of Inspector General legal counsel voiced grave concerns about the fragile waiver arrangement. In his opinion, the terms of the contract transferred, those words come from the Office of Legal Counsel, transferred the Office of Inspector General oversight function to DFAS, the very component whose financial data were being subjected to the oversight. In his words, meaning the Office of Legal Counsel's words, the contract terms will leave the Office of Inspector General, quote, open to criticism on the Hill. In 2 years, some senator will yell at us about this. If I had known about this arrangement, he said, I would have advised against it. Counsel's concerns were well-founded, and like a modern-day Nostradamus, this prediction has come to pass. The second problem was failure of leadership at the top. When the Inspector General's auditors reached the conclusion that the CPA firm's opinion did not measure up to prescribed standards, the current Deputy IG for Audit drove the final nail into that coffin. The official audit records make it crystal clear. The Department IG gave the fateful order, quote, there will be no written report, end of quote. This was a lethal blow. This is how the report got bottled up. True, it disappeared from public view. It got buried. And DFAS was promised it would never see the light of day. That is, until one of my investigators came along and dug it out of the pile of work papers. And here, for the benefit of my colleagues, here it is in my hand. I hold it up. It didn't get buried like they thought it would get buried. Once the Deputy IG had smothered the report, DFAS knew it had the green light to bypass oversight with impunity. All of this bungling could have harmful consequences. First, compelling audit evidence, which undermined the credibility of the financial statements prepared by the Department's flagship accounting agency, was shielded from public exposure. The suppression of that evidence has helped to immortalize the myth of DFAS clean opinions. It is so bad now that the myth is an inside joke. It's laughable, according to a former accountant. Here's what he said on the record in the press on November the 22nd, 2013. I quote, "When I was there, DFAS would brag about getting a clean opinion. We accountants would just laugh out loud. Their systems were so screwed up," end of quote. If the output of the Defense Department's flagship accounting agency, which disperses over $600 billion a year, is indeed laughable, then the Pentagon money managers have another big problem. As that famous whistleblower Ernie Fitzgerald liked to say, it's time to lock the doors and to call the law. Since the myth involves the reliability of data reported by the Department's Central Accounting Agency, it has the potential of putting the Secretary of Defense Audit Readiness Initiative in jeopardy. DFAS's apparent inability to accurately report on its own internal housekeeping accounts for $1.5 billion it's $1.5 billion that they have cast out on its ability to accurately report on hundreds of billions of DOD spends each year. If the Department's Central Accounting Agency cannot earn a clean opinion, then who in the Department can? Second, the integrity and independence of the Inspector General's audit process may have been compromised. If the independence of the audit process was in fact compromised, as my report suggests, then the Department's primary tool for rooting out waste and fraud could be disabled. At least it was in these cases. And if that did indeed happen, then it probably happened with the knowledge and silence, acquiescence of senior officials in the IG's office and the institution that exists to root out fraud, waste, and abuse. In simple terms, the watchdog appointed to expose waste well, not only expose but stop fraud and waste may have been doing some of it himself or herself. If true, it clearly demonstrates a lack of commitment on the part of senior management to exercise due diligence in performing its core mission. Almost all of the key players allegedly responsible for the bungled audits will occupy top posts in the IG's audit office today. Surely these officials did not act alone. This was a concerted effort. According to recent news reports, other higher-ups were allegedly involved, and senior IG officials must bear primary responsibility for this unacceptable and inexplicable failure of oversight. They could have, in fact, stopped it. To address and resolve these issues, I made 4 recommendations in a letter recently sent to Secretary Hagel and the new Inspector General Reimer. First, the Department of Defense CFO should pull the DFAS financial statements for the years 2008 and 2009 and remove those audit opinions from official records. Second, the OIG needs to undertake an independent audit of DFAS's financial statements for fiscal year 2012 and determine whether those statements and the CPA's firm's opinions meet prescribed audit standards. The fiscal year 2012 beginning account balances must also be verified. In response to my oversight, the Inspector General has initiated what he calls a post-audit review of DFAS fiscal year 2012 financial statements. This is, in fact, a good move. But to ensure that it is done right at this time, I asked the U.S. GAO to watchdog the Inspector General's work. I want independent verification because last time there was none. This process will be completed next year. And third, the Inspector General should address and resolve any allegations of misconduct involving DFAS's officials and make appropriate recommendations for corrective action. Fourth, I'm referring unresolved concerns regarding the conduct of the IG officials to the Integrity Committee of the Council of Inspector Generals on Integrity and Efficiency for further review as provided under the IG Reform Act of 2008. What happened here, Mr. President, is almost beyond comprehension. All of it happened under the IG's watchful eye. All of it probably happened with top-level knowledge. Most of it probably happened with top-level approval. Some of it was probably allowed to happen through tacit approval or silent acquiescence. All of it was bad for the integrity and independence of audit process and the accuracy of financial information in the government's largest agency. As I said a moment ago, the department has a new IG, John Reimer. I hope he is a genuine junkyard dog who likes aggressive, hard-hitting audits. And I hope that Mr. Reimer will take a long, hard look at what happened here and work with Secretary Hagel and others to find a good way to right the wrongs and get audits back on track. I know that he can do it, and I stand ready to help him in any way I can. I want Mr. Reimer to know that my door is open to him. On another matter, Mr. President, I rise to talk about the Farm Bill, specifically about reforming payment limits for farm workers, something that this Senate agreed to in a bipartisan way. Beyond saving money, these reforms help ensure farm payment go to those for whom they were originally intended, small and medium-sized farmers. In addition, the reforms include closing off loopholes so non-farmers can't game the system. Supporters of the Farm Bill need to take a hard look at what challenges were presented last year to getting a bill done. We need to forge ahead, knowing some tough decisions need to be made. There are more reforms that we need to make in programs such as food stamps, and they are reforms that can cut down on waste, fraud, and abuse in the program, but also safeguard assistance to the people who actually need it. And while I support closing loopholes in the food stamp program, I believe the Farm Bill should also close loopholes for farm programs that are so absurd that they're just so obvious. As we move forward on finalizing a new Farm Bill, I want to state clearly that Section 1603 and 1604 relating to the farm payments, which are in both the House bill and the Senate Farm Bill, should stay in that bill. There should be a do not stamp on those provisions under negotiation now between the House and Senate. And most importantly, for House conferees to remember that these provisions were put on the floor of the House of Representatives in an amendment sponsored by Congressman Fortenberry of Nebraska with an overwhelming vote in the House of Representatives. So this is a case of where the majorities of both bodies support these provisions, and yet they're under attack by House conferees. These farm payment reforms strike a needed balance of recognizing the need for a farm safety net while making sure that we have a defensible and responsible safety net. In case there is any doubt, we do need a farm program safety net. For those who argue we do not need a safety net for farmers, I argue they do not understand the dangers to a nation which does not produce its own food. For all the advances in modern agriculture, farmers are still subject to conditions out of their control. And while farmers need a safety net, there does not come a point where there does come a point where a farmer gets big enough that he can weather tough times without as much assistance from the government. Somehow, though, over the years, there's developed this perverse scenario where big farmers are receiving the largest share of the farm program payments. We now have the largest 10% of the farmers receiving